Okay, Jack, I'm going to hand it over to you. Let's take it away for Knoxville in the Roaring 20s.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Paul and Nicole, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're talking about the 1920s today, and why talk about the 1920s? Why talk about a decade, a century ago? It is one of our most famous decades, and I say by our, I mean by in America or perhaps the Western world. Even my daughter has attended 20s parties and generally knows what to wear, and this is remarkable to me that young people in their 20s know what a 20s party is. But if you think about it, The Great Gatsby is more read and more famous today than it was when it was published in 1925. It's been, what, 4 different movies over the years, the most recent with Leonardo DiCaprio, a very trendy version of it a few years ago. And other movies like Midnight in Paris, which I think is Woody Allen's most popular movie of this century, is all about the 1920s and kind of the mystique of the 20s. But there's much more to it, as we'll see. The 20s has to do a lot with Knoxville history, and both in terms of what Knoxville contributed to the global 20s, and also to the way the 20s, this crazy era, affected Knoxville. I think it in some ways invented the city as we know it. A lot of the things we think of as Knoxville today are things that were not part of Knoxville before the 1920s. It's the changing of years might seem meaningless. I thought this beginning of a new year might be a good time to talk about an era. It might seem meaningless, but so often personalities do get applied to decades, and they seem to have some meaning. In this case, the 1920s, the era right before the 20s, 1917 to 1920 in America in particular, brought traumatic change to American culture in lots of different ways. There were multiple big catastrophes we had to deal with. One was World War I, which of course took the lives of a couple hundred Knoxville kids. And even though it was a victory, it was a very sad and traumatic time for many people. And actually during World War I, in fact, during the worst part of World War I, was the last big pandemic we ever had to deal with, and that was the so-called Spanish flu, which took out another couple hundred Knoxvillians. We now have more people have died of COVID now than died of the Spanish flu in Knoxville, but of course we're a much bigger city now, so the proportions are still not as great, and also the Spanish flu was much quicker. It really hit us in just a few weeks of 1918. And then in 1919 we had a couple of riots, a very famous one that I think scarred Knoxville in a bad way. That was the Lynch Mob Riot, also known as the Race Riot of late summer of 1919, and a lot of people don't remember, it was followed a few weeks later by a big streetcar strike riot, which was also brought in the National Guard again to come to Knoxville and camped out at Caswell Park to try to put this riot down. We're thinking about riots these days, aren't we? I was trying to think of something relevant to bring into this, and certainly riots were part of this era right after World War I. I'm going to talk about another one in just a minute that a lot of people don't know about. But then, of course, in 1918 we had something called Prohibition was enacted, and as strange as it may seem, that we decided to ban ourselves the right to drink alcohol in America, and that changed society in lots of ways. And then something else happened in 1920, and that was women's suffrage. And this might be traumatic to some sectors of the population, the people who were strongly opposed to it, men and women both. But women could vote as of 1919, 1920, for the first time ever here in Tennessee, certainly. We saw a political shift of power from Democrats to Republicans, just the opposite this time. The Wilson era ended and the Harding-Coolidge era began. I'm not going to get into politics, but I don't think you have to be liberal or conservative to kind of be nostalgic for a day when our president was known as Silent Cal because he said so little. Can you imagine a president like that? But he was Warren G. Harding was president, and then when he died, Calvin Coolidge became president. He was elected on his own in 1924. But we here in Tennessee, we had politics didn't change very much. We had one Republican congressman for a long time. His name was J. Will Taylor. He was a congressman for about 20 years until he died in office in 1939. So he was our congressman, just kind of a get it done sort of congressman, not strongly ideological. And we had a couple of interesting senators who were Democrats, but they were opposed to each other about lots of things. We began the 20s with a guy named John Shields, was the Democrat from Tennessee. He was the brother of the donor of Shields-Watkins Field, which also plays into this narrative. But he was opposed to the League of Nations. And unlike the other Tennessee Democrat, who is Kenneth McKellar, who was a senator from Tennessee for 35 odd years, an amazingly long career in the Senate. But he was in favor of the League of Nations. So these were our legislators at the time. But anyway, this is the thing I was not going to mention until the events of yesterday was another riot that happened in 1921. It seemed like it was going to be a repeat of the 1919 riot when it started. It was another case of a black man accused of attacking a white woman. In this case, he didn't kill her, but it was apparently a sexual assault in a cornfield up in Inskip, and a black man was arrested for this. Put in jail, and there was a lynch mob downtown of several hundred people who wanted to pull him out and hang him. And the sheriff was ready for this, and so was the state. The Governor Alf Taylor got involved in this whole mess, and sent the state guard over here to try to quell the white lynch mob. They had, just like they did in 1919, they had machine guns, they had sawed-off shotguns, and they were at the jail. They weren't going to let these people into the jail, no way, no how. And they were a bit tougher on this crowd than the people, the police were yesterday in the Capitol, because they were not going to let them in under any circumstances. When they tried to get in, they started firing, and they shot about 40 people that day. And this is in August of 1921. According to one account, one person died and 40 were injured with various degrees of severity. But that they put it down. They just shut it right down pretty quickly. It's interesting that there were seasoned newspaper reporters there who'd been covered the 1919 riot. And they noticed that there was a very different tone in this mob. They said that there were no leaders to this mob, and there was no single purpose to this mob. They just were milling around looking for trouble, and as soon as they started firing, they scattered, and the ones that could run ran. But anyway, this was it ended very differently. The prisoner was held for 3 weeks, and they investigated and decided the guy probably didn't do it, and they let him go after 3 weeks, and that was the end of the story. Apparently, he saw a grand jury, and he was freed, and the woman decided it must be someone else, and I'm not sure she ever identified anyone else it could have been that attacked her. But anyway, after all these traumas, we had 4 years of violence and disease and unsettled issues around here that led to this different era, which we remember as the 1920s. A lot of things changed in Knoxville. The city looked very different at the end of the 1920s than it did at the beginning. When you think about it, in 1920, we had college football, but it was small and kind of pitiful. We had a place called Waite Field that was bumpy, and we'll have a picture of it later. It had rocks, and part of it was uphill, and it was. And we measured Vol fans in the hundreds, not the thousands, in 1920. Some people had cars in 1920, but in the 1920s, neighborhoods opened up to be developed anywhere, even off streetcar lines. Things changed. Houses and yards began to look different in the 1920s. There was no broadcast media at all in 1920. We didn't have TV, of course, and didn't have radio either. But at the end of the decade, we had several competing radio stations. So lots of things changed in this decade. Hardly any decade has seen more profound change in culture than the 1920s. But Knoxville was affected by the times, but it's also influenced the times. And I want to talk about some, just for a few minutes, talk about Knoxvillians, former Knoxvillians who out in the world were changing and creating the 1920s as we know it. The 1925, of course, was the year of the Scopes trial down in Dayton, which got international attention. And was involved several Knoxvillians. One with John Scopes' original lawyer, and the guy who was still officially his lead attorney during the trial was a Knoxvillian, a very eccentric Knoxville attorney and law professor, recently fired from UT, named John R. Neal. Fascinating, eccentric guy. But he worked with Clarence Darrow, and sometimes they didn't get along during the defense, but they ultimately were success. They made their point, at least, whether they were successful or not. But the trial itself was covered by several reporters from Knoxville. One was named Joseph Wood Crooch, and he was an important figure in Knoxville history. He born and raised in Knoxville, grew up on Cumberland Avenue. Was a UT grad, but interesting fellow who went to New York, became a very well-known kind of public intellectual in New York. He was a biographer. He wrote biographies of Edgar Allan Poe and lots of other people. He wrote books of philosophy. And he reviewed plays. It's interesting that he was kind of one of the early, considered the early authorities of Broadway in New York in the early 20s, early 20th century. But he became a significant intellectual figure. He wrote in 1929 a book called The Modern Temper, which is a very kind of a dark book. It's you might even call it a kind of a proto-existentialist book. The Modern Temper was a book that in which he said that we can't count on either God or science to solve our problems. There are some basic problems with the idea of existence. But it got a lot of attention, not only here, but in Europe as well. I can imagine the very young Jean-Paul Sartre or somebody in Paris reading The Modern Temper in 1929. It did cause a stir, even if not only a few Knoxvillians I know of read it at the time. But it was an interesting work. He later amended some of his views and later became one of the early important environmentalists. But this was not in the 1920s. Another guy who was at the Scopes trial was a guy named Paul Y. Anderson. He was a quarryman's son. From South Knoxville. He, in 1917, covered the St. Louis race riots, became kind of famous for that, but covered the Scopes trial, but later on won the Pulitzer Prize for covering the Teapot Dome scandal and kind of explaining how that whole thing happened, involving the Harding and Coolidge administrations. He's buried in South Knoxville at Island Home Baptist Church graveyard, a very interesting grave that was paid for by the famous journalist Haywood Broun, who I'll mention again in just a minute because he has another connection to Knoxville. Anyway, I encourage you to go see his grave. And also, there's a house on Phillips Avenue where his mother used to live, and when Paul Y. Anderson would come back home, he would stay in that house. Was here frequently in the 1920s and 30s. He actually was here and speaking to the Rotary Club in 1929, summer of 29, and predicted the stock market crash to the Knoxville Rotary Club. I don't know how many of them sold out and may have helped cause it by selling their stocks, but it was a very smart and underlooked guy. Knoxville left a major mark on Hollywood, and this is surprising to some people. A guy from Knoxville who had grown up here, at least, William Gibbs Mcadoo, was one of the most remarkable people who ever lived in Knoxville. He was an attorney first. He was a businessman. He created our first streetcar lines here. He later went on to New York and built the first subway tunnel under the Hudson River, or financed it, and later became Secretary of the Treasury under Wilson. But after that, you'd think that's enough to do in one career. After that, he moved to California and made friends with some people named Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, and founded a whole new motion picture studio called United Artists. He was the lawyer that they needed to make this unusual proposition work. But United Artists was one of the great business movie business stories of the 1920s. They gave actors more independence in their choices. But another guy from Knoxville who made a big dent on Hollywood is a guy that there's a brand new book about. His name is Clarence Brown. But there's a brand new book about him, not brand new, it's about maybe a year and a half old now, by Gwenda Young, an Irish scholar. But the book is called Clarence Brown, Hollywood's Forgotten Master. I don't know how many people can see my thing, but here's a copy of it right here. It's a really interesting book, really concentrates more on his Hollywood career than on his Knoxville youth. But he spent most of his youth here, was a graduate of Knoxville High School, which he honored in some of his movies in subtle ways, and was a graduate of UT, where he got 2 engineering degrees and was known he was kind of an engineer's director, sort of. He knew how to make things move and light up right and do all these things that other kind of baffled other directors. But he also had a way with actors, especially actresses, and he was known to be the Greta Garbo's favorite director, and some people credit him with discovering her. She put her in several movies, the 1920s silent movies. He made several of these silent movies, best known for The Signal Tower, Smoldering Fires, Flesh and the Devil. That was a Garbo movie. A Woman of Affairs, another one. But had made quite a big impact on Hollywood. And the scholar Gwenda Young thinks that he's been overlooked, that his contribution to Hollywood has been overlooked. But he grew up in basically in Old North Knoxville on Scott Avenue. That was his house. His last house is still standing there. But other people who lived in Knoxville had an effect on Hollywood. I just want to mention Frances Hudson Burnett, who lived here as a young woman, died in the 20s as an old lady. But 6 movies were made in Hollywood based on her works, especially Little Lord Fauntleroy. But movies starring Mary Pickford and Lionel Barrymore, big movies. But also there was a young woman who made a bit of a splash, was a brief sensation, at least in 1927. Her name was Helen Mundy. She was a well-known, very vivacious young dancer. She was a teenager who was well-known just for dancing and singing and doing little acting bits around town. But she was picked to be in a movie, a really unusual naturalistic movie in 1927. And Paul, I think we have a slide for that, called Stark Love. This is a movie that came out. It's about okay. I'm sorry. That's another one. Stark Love. This is Helen Mundy on the right there. She's starring in this movie that has mostly non-actors. She and her co-star are the only people who have any acting experience at all, and she just did some acting in vaudeville in Knoxville, basically. But that was she was this actress that really caught everybody's attention in 1927, 28. She was offered other roles, but she was kind of hard to handle. She didn't take orders very well, and she decided she did not like Hollywood at all, and just bolted and married a band leader, and never made another movie after this movie. But this was, believe it or not, this made some top 10 lists of the best movies of 1927. It was shown at the Tennessee Theater about 5 years ago, and it was really pleased to be there. But back to the woman we just saw briefly, Grace Moore. She was lived in Knoxville briefly as a young woman. She's more known for her growing up in Jellicoe. That was what she considered her hometown. But she was in Jellicoe. She was a basketball star. But she went from here. She had a great voice. Went from here and became a singer, well known at the Met in New York in the 1920s, and made this unusual bridge to star in popular Hollywood movies. A Met soprano starring in Hollywood movies, and in fact, she was the first. Later, was the first woman to be nominated for an Academy Award for a musical role. But she had strong Knoxville connections. Had lived here for a few years in her early youth, but came back and performed here at least once in the 20s and once or twice in the 30s as well. But it's hard to talk about the 20s without at least name checking Grace Moore. And one other thing about the 20s, when you think about the 20s, especially intellectuals in the 20s, you think about the Algonquin Roundtable, the very famous group of people who met in New York at the Algonquin Hotel every day. It included everybody from Dorothy Parker to Robert Benchley, Edna Ferber, Harper Marx even. But one of the most regular members of the Algonquin Roundtable was a woman named Ruth Hale, who was a feminist journalist who had spent part of her youth in Knoxville, and she became part of the 20s story as well. She's portrayed in, if you've seen the movie about the Algonquin Roundtable and the people connected to it, called Mrs. Parker and the Vicious Circle. Ruth Hale is depicted in that movie, portrayed by the actress Jane Addams. But she was really from Rogersville. She spent more of her youth in Rogersville than Knoxville. But I thought we'd mention her. By the way, I mentioned earlier Haywood Broun, who paid for Paul Y. Anderson's grave in Island Home Baptist Church Cemetery. He married her. That was her husband, Haywood Broun, the very famous journalist. And they had a son whose name you probably remember if you're as old as I am or older. Haywood Hale Broun was their son. That was her son and Haywood Broun's son, who was a very well-known figure in TV only 40 years ago or so. He did everything from sports reporting to Timex commercials, if you recall. But very interesting family. I could take up on the Hales of Rogersville quite a lot, but they all were remarkable in one way or another over the years. But anyway, I want to mention other things that other ways Knoxville affected the world, and one has a lot to do with music. Of course, we had a lot of musicians who were playing in Knoxville, especially in the late 20s, who would later make waves nationally, and they include, of course, people like Roy Acuff, who was just beginning to learn the fiddle here in Knoxville and beginning to play in some public venues in the late 1920s. But also people, and of course, Uncle Dave Macon was not from Knoxville, but performed here a lot, and he made his first records for Sturkey Brothers Furniture Company, which I guess we have some slides of Sturkey Brothers, right, Paul? Sturkey Brothers played a fascinating role in the history of country music, in that Sturkey Brothers was a furniture company, and you don't think of furniture companies as being connected to showbiz, but Sturkey's definitely was. Sturkey's sold phonographs, and by the 1920s, phonographs were old technology. They'd been around for 40 years or so, but they were becoming cheaper, and they were both better and cheaper as technology tends to get, as we've seen in our own lifetimes. But phonographs were cheaper, and they were cheap enough for working people to buy them. But the problem was the working people weren't interested in them because there weren't any records that they liked that you could play on phonographs. And they thought, why don't we get some of these buskers or these country musicians, these hillbilly musicians, folk musicians, what do you want to call them, pick them up off the streets and record them, put them on the train to New York, and make some records in New York, and maybe we can sell them in our stores in Knoxville. And this was not an obvious thing to do because country music was not well known. It was something on the fringes. A lot of people had heard it in the background here and there. It was part of some families' histories and not other families' histories. People in Knoxville were from all over. Some people were from Switzerland or other countries. Some were from up north. Some were from other cities, and they just didn't have any country music in their background. But we start seeing country music for the first time ever slipping into Knoxville around the edges. Around 1924, there was a mention in the newspaper that you could pick up WSB in Atlanta, and it sometimes had this old time music on your new radio. We got radio, by the way, in 1922. But people like Sturkey's sent people like Charlie Oakes, George Renault, Mac and Bob, people like this up to New York to make records, and Uncle Dave Macon, who became much more famous than any of the others. Otherwise, you see occasional mentions of this. It's fascinating to try to trace the slowly dawning interest in country music. I found yesterday a mention of a 1928 Chautauqua Meeting. You know what Chautauqua is? It's like usually kind of a educational or intellectual gathering, and they had a Chautauqua tent set up on Magnolia in 1928, and it was organized by a British guy named Malcolm Miller, who was really usually associated with classical music, but he was also interested in folk music. And he got this guy from Vermont named Charles Ross Taggart, who was a fiddler and loved America's country music traditions, including mainly he was interested in New England's, and that's what he was giving a talk and a demonstration about at this Chautauqua tent in 1928. But that's the first time I've ever seen the phrase country music in any Knoxville newspaper was describing this kind of a mongrel sort of an event of a British guy hosting a fiddler from Vermont on Magnolia Avenue, talking about country music. But later on, a professor, L.S. Mayer from UT, gave a talk at East Tennessee Historical Society, which then in those days met at Lost Mead Library, about folk music of the Great Smoky Mountains. And more about that later. This is 1928 again. The Smokies had a big effect on Knoxville culture in a lot of interesting, surprising ways. But this revival of what was considered an old-fashioned kind of music, and when they talk about old time, they talk about pre-Civil War music is what they were talking about. And there was kind of a revival of interest in this music that had almost died out, and it was almost like architecture, that there this sense of revival of old styles in the 1920s, and almost like a Renaissance. You see the same kind of ethic in a way with the Italian Renaissance, looking back to the ancient world for their inspirations and changing things, improving things, and presenting them to a modern population. And that's what a lot of people in the 1920s in music and architecture and other realms were doing. But 1929 was the year that Knoxville got enough of attention for all this ferment in music, that Brunswick Vocalion, one of the three biggest record labels in America, decided they would come here and make some field recordings, try to make some recordings at the St. James Hotel in downtown Knoxville. And they sent Dick Voynow, who was a famous guy in the 20s because he was a jazz pianist. He'd been in Bix Beiderbecke's Wolverines, was a well-known pianist. He'd worked with Hoagie Carmichael, well-known songwriter of the time. But they set up a shop. They created a record studio here in 1929 at the St. James Hotel, and recorded almost anybody that walked in and wanted to try something out. And they give them a listen and say, yeah, let's give it a try. And they cut more than 100 records in this hotel over a period of several months. A lot of the music was old time, but they got a lot of jazz and blues at this time too. The only recordings of Leola Manning were made here, who's now remembered as kind of a very interesting early blues singer, who was apparently gave it up not long after this and became more religious still when she was still a young woman. But also the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, the famous Tennessee Chocolate Drops, were their only recordings were made at the St. James in 1929 and 30. A small black string band, including Howard Armstrong and Carl Martin, who were individually famous on their own, and would later go on to have somewhat separate careers, but then they got back together as 2/3 of Martin, Bogan, and Armstrong, as in their much later years. We have a picture of Howard Armstrong, don't we, Paul? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. This is Paul gave me a list of the slides, and I'm going off the rails here. This is Howard Armstrong much later, obviously. This is the Howard Armstrong I got to know a little bit when I was interviewed him a few times. He remembered Knoxville in the 20s more vividly than anybody I've ever talked to. Was well known for walking up and down East Vine Street, playing his fiddle and his mandolin to whatever crowd he could find, just pulling doors, as he said. He would walk into a barber shop or a pawn shop or whatever drugstore and just start playing and see what happened. I'd love to think I could do that with history. We'd walk in and start giving a lecture in any kind of a place and see what happens. But anyway, this is I want to mention that's a great picture of him. Very colorful guy. Even he was still performing in his 90s. He began his career before radio, and he was still playing in the era of the podcast. Just an amazingly long career. But this little ad is for a dance at the Wayside Inn tonight and Saturday. Wayside Inn was in Bearden. A lot of people know Naples. That's exactly where it was. Naples was originally the Wayside Inn, but was rebuilt in the 1940s to what you remember now. But this is the original Wayside Inn. And this was just barely outside of city limits. So we could get away with more stuff at the Wayside Inn than you could in town. They had gambling and liquor and all sorts of things at the Wayside Inn. But they also had late night dances, amazingly late night dances. Their dances would start at midnight here in the late 1920s. And people like the Tennessee Chocolate Drops or traveling jazz bands from New Orleans or white bands, anybody might be playing at the Wayside Inn, and there were dressy crowds from Knoxville would come, and also tourists who were just staying at the nearby motor courts would come. It was kind of a couples night sort of thing, but they would sometimes play literally until morning, and then they would serve everybody breakfast at 7 in the morning after they've been dancing and drinking all night. This was one of the locations of kind of the roaring 20s. This is one of the places that made the 20s roar in Knoxville. But back to this was our best known jazz band, a white kind of our early big band, and this was Maynard Baird, who's the guy in the center, and he's holding a banjo, and he didn't solo on the banjo, but he used the banjo mainly for percussion. But he was the conductor and leader of this jazz band. They got some currency up and down the East Coast. They were well known in the Northeast and also the Midwest. They toured a lot. But I think the only recordings they made were those they made at the St. James Hotel. I'm glad we have those. There are 6 or 8 sides that they cut there. But very surprisingly sophisticated sounding, kind of lighthearted. Jazz dance music is what they played. Maynard Baird was an interesting fellow, lifelong showbiz guy. He started his career as a projectionist at the Old Majestic Theater, but he was this was the sound of the 20s. Maynard Baird's Southland Serenaders. Let's see. Don't want to get too far off track, but but music has a lot to do with what was going on in Knoxville, and some music was jazz was really more popular than anything, literally anything more popular than country, whatever you called it back in those days. But also we had a good deal of classical music going on. A lot of fermenting classical music was happening in the 1920s. We have a woman named Bertha Walburn Clark who had arrived in Knoxville in the very early 20th century, and that's her in the white on the left. Bertha Walburn Clark was a violinist originally from Cincinnati, and began playing her first at a gig in the old Atkin Hotel, and later had a quartet, and later on had what she called her little symphony. And this is her little symphony here, playing at the Farragut Hotel, the same place as now the Hyatt place on Gay Street. But this was the old oak room, kind of in the back, kind of the ballroom that was sort of a few steps up from the main lobby. But this was the origin of the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra. Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, one of the very few orchestras in the world founded by a woman, and she was the conductor of the KSO in its early days. This is before the KSO, this picture, but this was the 1920s, and this if you went to the Farragut Hotel in the 20s, you might be hearing Bertha and her musicians performing there. But this was a great time for classical music. Lots of well-known musicians came through town. Sergei Rachmaninoff, the first time he came here, where a lot of people know that he played his last performance here years later, but he played here earlier too at Old Staub's Opera House. Grace Moore, also we mentioned earlier, was an occasional performer here, but also interestingly, a couple of black singers, including Roland Hayes, well-known male singer, but also Marion Anderson, who would later on, like 12 years later on, her singing at the Lincoln Memorial would cause a great deal of controversy in Washington, because people didn't expect a black singer to take front and center stage for a major occasion. I think it was 4th of July or something, and some groups tried to ban her. But Marion Anderson sang in Knoxville at Staub's Opera House, the single biggest auditorium we have in town, back in 1927. And she was here a couple other times, often singing in churches, but sang mainly classical repertory stuff, but in operatic style singing. But mostly we had jazz, and we had in 1921 the great Mamie Smith, I think the very first black female performer on record, was at the Gem Theater in April of 1921. And people like Maynard Baird would play at the Riviera Theater on a regular basis. Leola Manning, I mentioned earlier, well-known singer, was here and there. And Tennessee Chocolate Drops were here until about 1931, when they moved to Chicago, and kind of astonished people up there because they had a style unlike that of any of the Mississippi Delta guys. But other well-known performers, Earl Hines, the pianist, was here a good deal in the 20s and 30s. Noble Sissel, who was a Broadway star, was here several times. But there's an irony here, then, that black culture was much more prominent in the 20s, African-American culture, than it ever had been before. But in the 1920s, segregation was also getting stricter than it ever had been before. And this is something that's kind of hard to square when we look back at this time. This was the time of real estate covenants, the beginning of this idea that if you buy this house, you can't sell it to anybody but another white person. That was written into these contracts that people could sign. It was not until 1968 that these were abolished by the Fair Housing Act. But this was a time of contradictions in many ways. It was a time of prohibition. We didn't have any liquor stores. We didn't have any bars. You couldn't openly buy any liquor, but people found it anyway. There were speakeasies all over the place. There were bootleggers that would deliver it to your house. But there were many places of these speakeasy places were downtown and walk-up places, but many of them were, as I say, just outside of city limits, in places like Bearden, which had not only the Wayside Inn, but the Spanish Gardens, roadside burger joints by day, which became nightclubs by night. And I wonder if Prohibition somehow concentrated creative minds and created something different from what we would have had if things had been more open in the 1920s. I want to mention just briefly literature. Knoxville has become known for literature in recent decades, but most of that was yet to come. James Agee was a high school student at Knoxville High School for about a year and a half in 1924-25 before his mom moved them up to New England. Tennessee Williams, the playwright, never lived in Knoxville, but he was here frequently. His sister Rose spent many months here in the 1920s, and it was Rose that he wrote at least 3 of his best-known plays about. Charles Chancellor, the black teacher, was teaching here at the time and may have been was probably already working on his book, autobiographical book, 3 Generations, which is more interesting in retrospect. It was not that well known when it came out. People thought, isn't it odd that this black man is writing his memoirs and talking about his family? But in some ways, looking back on it, it was kind of a precursor to Roots, the idea of looking back at your family and your ancestors, and how they dealt with various challenges along the way. But the 20s was a time of interesting newspaper writers. This was the time when New Sentinel columnists like Bert Vincent began writing. Bert Vincent, very bold and colorful writer for the New Sentinel for many years. Began his career. He's from Kentucky. Began his career at the New Sentinel in the 1920s. But also Lucy Templeton, who was a woman who was hired to write about birds and flowers and trees, but ended up writing sometimes about Russian literature and politics and other things that people didn't expect her to write about. But she had a following, so they let her keep doing it. But interesting time to read the newspaper. 1920s newspapers I think are better reading than almost any other era. But a lot of this was driven by technology. Then as now, rapid changes and technology are one reason that we remember the 1920s. Radio was something that we had our first radio station in 1922. It shouldn't be surprising that it was a teenager that gave it to us. A guy named Stuart Adcock. It was just 16 years old or so. Started a radio station, and suddenly we had radio, and he sold that one and started another one to compete against it. So we had, by the end of the decade, we had like 3 radio stations that were competing against each other. And they were trying all kinds of things. People didn't know what radio was for yet. So there was a lot of live music. There were lectures, there were all kinds of things in radio. It was kind of exciting and unpredictable. Anytime you turn on your radio, what you're going to hear. But phonographs, I mentioned, were getting cheaper, and this was a kind of another conduit for pop music along with radio. Cars had been around for a while, but they were more popular than ever in the 1920s. And this was a time that middle-class people were starting to buy cars. And they changed lifestyles and also changed architecture in interesting ways. Airplanes, we had three fields in Knoxville. The Knoxville Airport, the first Knoxville Airport was established in 1929. And I'm trying to see if that is the next slide on the agenda, Paul. Yeah, it sure is. I'm lucky. There we go. This is the original Knoxville McGee Tyson Airport as it was established in 1929 on what had been an airfield before that. And this is all along Sutherland Avenue. If you see that line up and down the street, that's across the picture. That's Sutherland Avenue. And this was the area that's now covered by West High and the National Guard Armory and the athletic fields, which are over to the left part of that picture. But this was the airport, and it was not only the place where the first passenger planes, which held maybe half a dozen passengers at most, took off from. But it was also where people came to see stunt flyers, and in the 1920s, it was the time of the barnstormers, people coming and doing amazing stunts in their planes, and also showing off these really unusual planes, some early like gyrocopters and the first monoplanes people saw, and the Ford Trimotor, all these things, these amazing new airplanes that people had not seen before. They got to see here at the what was very recently known as the Bearden Airfield, before it was McGee Tyson Airport, or just the aviation field or the airplane field, but it's interesting what the impact this had on so many kids around here who grew up along Kingston Pike or somewhere, and you could buy a plane for a couple $100s in those days, a surplus World War I Jenny, and learn to fly it. But many people in the Bearden area became pilots. Some of them kind of famous pilots as time went on. But anyway, that's another one of the exciting things that people could do. People would literally take the streetcar out, the Lions View streetcar out to watch these giant air shows, and sometimes 10,000 people would show up at this field and watch famous flyers like Jimmy Doolittle do stunts in the air above Bearden. But one thing Knoxville is known for today, Knoxville is very proud of, obviously, is sports. Baseball had been the main Knoxville's main sport for many years. We'd had baseball since the 1860s, and baseball in 1920 was still 1921, especially when it was kind of revived at Caswell Park. Was the most popular sport, spectator sport in Knoxville. Not only did we have a local team that we're proud of, they were originally called the Knoxville Pioneers. Later in the 20s became known as the Knoxville Smokies, as the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was developed. But they were it was not only local teams, but often big league teams, including the New York Yankees, would come here and play exhibition games here in Knoxville. It was kind of halfway between their here in their training place in Florida. But Babe Ruth was here several times. We have a picture of Babe Ruth here in Knoxville with a couple of Curbella guys and some cops as well. Interesting picture from 1925. This is the first of several appearances of Babe Ruth in Knoxville, and there are all sorts of stories about home runs that he hit at Caswell Park and where he hit them. Later on, he was here with his teammate Lou Gehrig, and they would stay at a place like the Farragut Hotel, and all the kids would wait outside the hotel hoping to catch them to get their autograph. But meanwhile, baseball was bigger than football. I mentioned Wakefield was this really rough edge place. People made fun of Tennessee football just because we didn't have a proper place to play it. Wakefield was a place that it had a lip. One corner of the field was actually a little bit uphill. It was right by the hill there. It was really a ragged field. If you kicked a field goal, the ball bounced out into Cumberland Avenue. This was the only field we had until 1921. And I don't know if UT is planning to celebrate this, but this is the centennial. 2021 is the centennial of Shields Watkins Field, which of course was we now know is just part of Neyland Stadium. And Neyland Stadium is named for a guy who arrived here in the 1920s. His name was Robert Neyland, from West Point, kind of a genius football strategist who came here with all sorts of unusual ideas about football that had not been tried before, and I don't think have been tried since, about emphasizing defense over offense. But something happened in the 1920s here at UT, and this field where, as I say, you that whole audience there is probably 150 people or so. And when they first built Shields Watkins Field in 1921, there were seats for about 3,000 fans to watch the Vols play. By the end of the 1920s, same decade, we were up to 18,000 fans at Shields Watkins Field. That it multiplied by a factor of 6, and probably have some early pictures of Shields Watkins Field, don't we? The early stands there, but this is what it looked like in the 1920s when they're building the early stands there where Neyland Stadium is today. But just imagine this: 3,000 people in 1921, 18,000 at the end of the 20s. So this was really, and it was partly to see the amazing things that Coach Nealon was doing with his team. He was bringing them to a national scale, a national level, which they had never been before. In the early 1920s, the Vols mainly played Maryville College, Carson Newman, Chattanooga. Most of the teams they played were within 300 miles or so of home. They did play Alabama now and then and usually lost, but Nealon started beating Alabama and got and this is the beginning of that rivalry that got people excited about football in Knoxville for the first time. Even people who were not girlfriends of the players started coming to games. Anyway, it's really Vol-mania was invented in the 1920s, and this brings up the idea of architecture. You see a particular building down there at the bottom that we'll be talking about. That's from the 1920s as well. Ayers Hall. Ayers Hall was built 100 years ago this year. A lot of people think it's older than that, but it was designed. It replaced a building that was in the same place that had been there since the 1820s and had also had a tower in it. But Ayers Hall is much bigger, much grander. Was designed around 1918 by a Chicago architect who did a lot of work here, named Grant Miller, with Miller, Full and Water, and Dowling. But it was made this really iconic building that has been used as a symbol of UT ever since it was finished in 1921. Anyway, this is again the centennial of Ayers Hall as well. Ayers Hall and Shields-Watkins Field were built at the same time. The checkerboard, by the way, up there, they say that came later on the football field, but it was modeled on the design on the tower of Ayers Hall up there. But a beautiful building, and whether you call it Gothic or not, a lot of architects say no, it's not Gothic, it's Renaissance revival. But it does have some gargoyles on it. It's one of the very few buildings in town that has gargoyles on it. But it's a cool thing to have. Anyway, lots of changes in architecture throughout the 1920s. We began building big movie theaters. Movie theaters had always been just kind of small storefront places before the 1920s. 1920, we built the Riviera Theater, where the Regal Riviera is now a completely different building now, but it was a big, grand-looking theater, almost like an opera house. 1920 held 1,000 people. People had never seen anything like that in this part of the country, anyway. And then, of course, the Tennessee Theater, 8 years later. These were both Paramount studio projects, partly governed out of Hollywood. It was designed, Tennessee Theater was designed by a short-lived architectural firm called Graven and Mager, also out of Chicago. Chicago had a big effect on the look of Knoxville in these days. But we had the Tennessee Theater was being built about this time, and just was just an amazing thing to see in 1928, and still is today. And in fact, there were more. It's probably more unusual today because there were more of these kind of and this is actually the very first movie ever shown there, The Fleet's Inn with Clara Bow. So this must have been the opening day. All this big crowd hanging around outside on October 1st, 1928. This was just an amazing thing to see. There were more of these Moorish revival theaters in the 1920s, and they were built only between 1925 and 1930. This style that you see when you walk inside, and there were many more of them in the late 20s than there are now. So it may be even more remarkable to see today than it was in that time. But anyway, there were other theaters in town built around the same time, and one was the New Gem Theater, which was an all-black movie theater on East Vine Street. And this became kind of one of the great landmarks of East Vine. This was a theater that was pretty big. It wasn't as big as the Tennessee, but it had, by some accounts, it seated as many as 1,000 people. But this was a place where Black people, many of them who could just walk there, often didn't have cars, could walk to could walk to see movies and also shows. I mentioned earlier, Mamie Smith performed there earlier. Ida Cox was there. There are also sorts of stories I've not nailed down about people like Billie Holiday performing there. It's possible, perfectly possible that she did. But Noble Sissel, lots of people like that performed there over the years. But had quite a history. But other people were trying different things. The Bowman and Bowman, the family of architects, designed the Andrew Johnson Hotel on Gay Street. This was the tallest building ever built in East Tennessee and remained that for 50 years. The Andrew Johnson Hotel on the left is still there. I'm glad to say, not a hotel, hadn't been a hotel since the 1970s, but this was 17 stories tall, was taller than anything in Chattanooga at the time. The tallest building in East Tennessee. It was a big deal, and they used to have radio broadcasts from the top, just like they did from the top of the Waldorf Astoria in New York. I think that was the model for those things. But a lot of the early country music recordings, broadcasts were up there. But also this was Charles Barbour's heyday. Charlie Barbour, the architect behind Barbour McMurray. He was a young man in the 1920s and was trying lots of interesting new things. This was the time of the beginning of modernism, the time of Bauhaus, but Charlie Barbour had nothing to do with that. He loved the revival styles. He loved the older styles of buildings. He designed buildings like the YMCA downtown, and also I think his great his masterpiece is Church Street Methodist Church. This is the YMCA 1929. I'm glad it's still there and still a YMCA. It was still at the time they built it, it was a residential YMCA, but now it's got condos upstairs instead of young men staying in small rooms. But just across the way is something he was working on at the very same time. The Church Street Methodist Church, just enormously kind of amazing church. I think the most interesting church ever built from the outside, and certainly and inside as well. It's got a lot of detailed work inside that he just loved this kind of medieval revival style, Gothic style, kind of high Gothic is what this church is. He worked a little bit with a well-known Washington D.C. architect, John Russell Pope, who also designed the Jefferson Memorial after this. But anyway, Charlie Barbour designed lots and lots of houses, kind of in all in this sort of style that you can imagine Errol Flynn swinging from the chandeliers or something, and all of these houses on Kingston Pike and in Sequoia Hills and other places. But later became much associated with the University of Tennessee and kind of the collegiate Gothic style. But going on, suburbanism affected things in lots of ways here. As people moved out into the what had been pastures and countryside, they realized they could have big yards and have all sorts of styles of houses, and people didn't, the architects, developers didn't want all the houses to look alike, even though they were being built at the same time. For years, you would expect houses built in the same era to look kind of similar to each other. But the 1920s was different. There were no rules anymore. They said, we're going to just reach back to history and different eras of history and try to create new things and do interesting things. And this is something they tried in these new automobile suburbs, a whole new idea. Automobile suburbs sprang up here and there. Sequoia Hills was one. Tallahassee was one, which is a separate thing from Sequoia Hills in the early days. And Holston Hills was one, and North Hills was one. And the architecture was more eclectic, and it was more based on this revival idea. This is at Tallahassee. These interesting monuments that must puzzle people today. They are kind of reflect this ethic of reviving old styles in new ways. And you see this panther head, which was believed to be directly influenced by the discovery of King Tut's tomb, which was one of the influences on 20s architecture. It was what, in 1922 that Howard Carter found King Tut's tomb in Egypt and found this amazing stuff, and he starts seeing kind of echoes of King Tut's imagery in places. But also it has a lot of Cherokee imagery in here as well. The Thunderbird motif appears over and over in Tulahi, and the water spiders and things like this from Cherokee imagery, but also Art Deco. This was the era of Art Deco, and you see that here as well. This is all from the Tulahi part of Sequoia Hills. Tulahi was a kind of a fascinating failure. Basically, it was launched in 1926 as this perfect planned community. And it was very expensive to buy into, and the number of people who got into it were limited even before the Great Depression hit, and it went completely belly up, but and became part of Sequoia Hills. But we still have these monuments left of it. But you can look over town and see these 1920s neighborhoods, and I think perhaps you see it in a lot in Holston Hills as well, and perhaps North Hills is a place where you can go and see it just as it looked in the 1920s. Those houses haven't been changed. Some of them have had some additions here and there, but you can kind of see the 1920s ethic, this eclectic revival of Spanish revival and kind of a colonial revival. All these interesting just reaching back to old styles and reviving them. But one of the ones who really loved this and who almost got a job, and actually was offered a job and accepted the job with Barbour McMurray, but never worked it out, was a guy named John Van Staub, who ended up doing most of his work in Texas. But he designed one very interesting house in Knoxville called Hope Coat on UT campus now. John Van Staub designed this in 1924. We have a picture of that, I believe, Paul. This is, if you ever seen this house at UT campus, this is used as a guest house by UT. It was a private residence for many years before that, but John Van Staub did this as a very young man, and it looks like an old English cottage, but inside and out, and the detail in this house is incredible. But he was very much in the same tribe as Barbour McMurray. And would have joined them as a partner. He was offered a partnership, but kept getting these jobs in Houston. Ended up moving his practice there, and became very well known there. And designed Bayou Bend, one of the most famous houses in Houston. But anyway, we see all these kind of revival styles, and modernism, as I say, in the late 20s was coming out of Bauhaus in Germany, and we don't see that much reflected until the 1930s and 40s, and don't see it much then either. But in the 1920s, you start seeing some modernist principles, like in buildings like the Daylight Building on Union Avenue, which is a very successful preserved building today. It has bookstore and restaurant and residences upstairs. This is a building that was unusual in the day in that it had daylight. You can see by the shadows. This is before the Pembroke was built across the street, which is really called the new Sprankle building. But this was when it was first built in 1926, 27, about the same time the Tennessee Theater was being built. If you can imagine these completely opposite buildings, Tennessee Theater with no daylight at all and very, very rich in its ancient detail, and the Daylight Building, which is trying to be modern with lots and lots of daylight. It's interesting to think that happening at the same time, just a couple blocks away from each other. But also buildings, new modern buildings like the Prior Brown parking garage, kind of a new kind of a building. Now it's one of the oldest parking garages in America. But also want to get into art. This is one of the more interesting things, parts of the story in the 1920s. There's more to art in the 1920s than I realized for years. I always knew that the 1920s was kind of the last gasp of the old Nicholson Art League, this late Victorian organization of artists who included some impressionists who got together and became Nicholson Art League. I'd tracked it over the years and found that it became more decorative in the 20s, and I think it was more a club for rich ladies to get together and talk about art. And because a lot of the original founders had died or moved away or moved on in one way or another. Lloyd Branson, one of the original founders, died in 1925. His close friend, Catherine Wiley, Knoxville's best known impressionist and Tennessee's best known impressionist, was institutionalized in 1926. This is Lloyd Branson with one of his last works, the portrait of Alvin York. And this is Catherine Wiley. This is one of her late pieces, a 1921 piece called Morning. A lot of her later work is kind of melancholy, and we don't know exactly what happened to her, but she was committed to a mental institution in 1926 in her 40s, and spent the rest of her life up in Philadelphia area, and did not make any more paintings, at least. And she made some cartoony things after that, but this is kind of her late era. See, I always thought that this whole era kind of ended with them, and also Charles Crooch, who kind of kept going. He was more famous in his elderly years. Someone my age loves to see an example of someone like Charles Christopher Crooch, sometimes known as the Corot of the South, who made his most famous work when he was in his 70s, and they're mainly landscapes of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But he was still going into his early 80s. But it was also a guy named Buford Delaney, who was very close to Lloyd Branson, worked in his studio for a couple of years. Buford Delaney was a young black man who was a very talented artist. This is one of his first known works of art, and he did it here in Knoxville in the early 20s. It's an early landscape, and of course Buford Delaney was better known for his really extravagant and luminescent abstract works. But this is an early experiment, an early piece of work of his. Would love to find if there are any other earlier pieces of his, because we know that he was painting stuff back in the teens even. But he was here until 1923, working with Lloyd Branson in a studio on Gay Street, until Lloyd Branson said, "Look, you're really talented. We need to get you to an art school so we can go places." And Lloyd Branson and Hugh Tyler and Charles Chancellor, the well-known black intellectual, who they got together and raised some money and sent him, Buford Delaney, to Boston to school. Buford Delaney was 22 at the time, and he came back to visit after that, but never came back to live. I'm glad the Beck Center is now preserving a house next to the Beck Center. There will be the Delaney Center, a building that was owned by their brother, where both Buford and Joseph Delaney, his younger brother, who was also an artist, who was in and out of town. Joseph Delaney was in and out of town in the 1920s, developed more as an artist in New York in the 1930s. Anyway, but it was the end of an era in some ways, the end of the era of the Nicholson Art League, but it was the beginning of a new era too. And there's a guy named Robert Lindsay Mason, who had a studio on East Cumberland Avenue, over near where the Coliseum is now. And he's best known for a book that he both wrote and illustrated called The Lure of the Great Smokies. I wish I had a copy of this book. This is I've seen it in the library. There's still some copies around, but it's just a classic work. This is before the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was officially open. He knew it. He knew the mountains well. He'd given lectures about the mountains to the Nicholson Art League and other things since the teens. But he was just fascinated with the mountains. It's a beautifully written book. There aren't many artists who are really good writers, or writers who are very good artists, but Robert Lindsay Mason is one of them. And he had studied art with Maxfield Parrish, the well-known illustrator, and Howard Pyle, and came back and taught what he'd learned to teachers. He had a small art school in the studio on East Cumberland. And among his students was a guy named Dave Huffine, who was in 1920s became a well-known cartoonist, a successful cartoonist in New York in later years. But Robert Lindsay Mason and his crew were part of the development of the Melrose Art Center, which was an old house, a beautiful old Italianate house on what's now UT campus. This is interior shot, rare interior shot of the Melrose Art Center, but it was basically an art museum, and they had sculpture in the lawn, and they had events, and they had a coffee shop that various artists helped run. But one of Robert Lindsay Mason's star students was a guy named Charles Griffin Farr, who was had studied with Mason and also gone over to Paris at the same time that Hemingway and them were over there. Charles Griffin Farr was studying in Paris. This guy from Knoxville who would study with Mason, and he painted this picture in the 40s, and it's called "The Street in Knoxville." And it's and I had, when I first saw this at the KMA a few years ago, I thought it was set in the 40s, but I said, wait a second, I began looking at the buildings and looking at the signs and so forth. And I said, this has to be in the 20s. He did this in the 40s in the Bay Area, but it was based on memories of Knoxville in the 1920s. But this came out and got a good deal of attention when he painted it and displayed it in Bay Area galleries. And this was a couple of writers looked at this and called this, said we need to come up with another name for this. This is during the abstract era, other people doing different things, but Charles Griffin Farr is doing something different too. This looks like something we call magic realism. Believe it or not, if you look at for this phrase in history, the first time it's used, and it's used a couple of times to describe it, is in California papers describing this one painting about Knoxville by Charles Griffin Farr. I believe that this setting, by the way, is kind of a depiction of Fifth Avenue, roughly, on the kind of the north side of downtown. Not necessarily a becoming picture, but a very interesting and kind of moody picture of his hometown. We go into his story a good deal in the book Knoxville Lives too, especially about his mother, who ran a coffee shop downtown, and I think had an interest in kind of connecting artists. But another form of art that has a lot to do with the 1920s is, of course, photography. This was an art that had been around for a long time, but people were doing new things with it in the 20s. And one of our I think our single most well-known and successful photographer was Jim Thompson. And again, in Knoxville Lives too, my colleague Paul James wrote I think the longest and most complete story of Jim Thompson's life in that volume. But Jim Thompson was a photographer even going back to the 1890s when he was a teenager, but he here's a picture of him up in the mountains marking the Appalachian Trail. But he this brings him to but he also had a brother, Robin Thompson, who learned aerial photography in World War I, and he became, if you see an aerial picture of Knoxville from the 1920s, chances are it was taken by Jim Thompson's brother, Robin. But back to the mountains, though, the mountains gave Knoxville a new focus. The mountains had always been there. We'd always seen them at a distance. On a clear day, you can see them at least. They're sometimes visible, but rarely visited before the automobile era. And it was not until the 1920s, and specifically 1923, when a woman named Annie Davis spoke to her husband and said, gosh, they've been out west. They said, why can't we make a national park out of the Smoky Mountains right here near where we live in Knoxville? And Annie Davis and her husband Willis Davis got this ball rolling. Then Colonel David Chapman, the well-known pharmaceutical executive, got involved, as did Jim Thompson. And other people got this going. Annie Davis, by the way, was one of our very first female elected officials. She was elected to the state legislature in 1925 and furthered the Great Smoky Mountains National Park project through her work in the legislature. She's really, you can call her the mother, I think, of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But this really started going in the mid-1920s. Most people who lived in Knoxville had never been to the Smokies, had never seen them up close. And this all changed radically in the mid-1920s and affected everything. As I mentioned, it affected a lot of things we've talked about tonight. It affected the interest in country music. It affected the size of the hotels we're building at down, because suddenly we're expecting these masses of people to come to see the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and to stay in these tall hotels like the Andrew Johnson Hotel on Gay Street. But it affected us in lots and lots of different ways. Lots of reason for excitement. People like Clarence Darrow, after the Scopes trial, the first thing he did after he left Dayton, he came up to see the Great Smokies National Park in 1925. They went up and stayed at Elkmont for a while. Will Rogers was here in 1926. Had heard about him, was fascinated, wanted to see him. But there were in literature, there are descriptions of people and places. It was an exciting new place to describe for Bert Vincent and Robert Lindsay Mason. And Harvey Broom, future founder of the Wilderness Society, was a writer. Laura Thornburg, but also architecture. I mentioned it had an effect on architecture for tourists, at least. It had an effect on music, the survival of mountain music. We didn't know what mountain music was, or a lot of people didn't before the 1920s. For art, we'd see it was a place for artists to come, landscapes, people like Mary Granger, who'd been an art teacher in Knoxville. But even people like Dave Huffine, who made a career as a cartoonist, or a modernist realist like Charles Griffin Farrar. They were hikers. They were early hikers in the Smokies, even before it was open as a national park. That's one of these things all these artists have in common, is this fascination with the national park. But also architects. Charles Barbour was a big hiker. He was a very enthusiastic hiker, the architect. And photographers like Jim Thompson, who we see over on the right in this picture. There are several other folks, well-known, Brockway Crouch, the florist, and who's that, Paul? Oh, that's Brockway Crouch. Yeah, and that's Jim Thompson over there. But
Dutch Roth on the left.
Dutch Roth, that's right. Yeah, a photographer. And but there was this flare of creativity in Knoxville in the 1920s that seemed to affect everything. Art, architecture, music, especially, came after this traumatic spell of disease and violence and hatred that we'd gotten past somehow, or gotten at least partway past, and we were wanting to do something different. It would seem like a new era, and because it seemed like a new era, it was a new era. And I wonder if this is what we can expect of the 2020s as well. I think they've kind of set a high and interesting bar for us to try to match in this new century. But anyway, thanks. As usual, I had more to talk about than I thought I did, and the 1920s is a fascinating time that I think really created Knoxville as we know it. Any questions or comments out there? All right. Well, I hope I've given you all a respite from the news lately. I'm almost afraid to turn on the television tonight. I may not even do it, but it's been fun to talk to y'all about a very interesting decade, and I wouldn't be surprised if our new decade is interesting in some similar ways.